Good morning, Year 8s. Today we're going to be looking at a few other features of medieval society. I'm going to run you through a quick PowerPoint and then I'm going to get you to do a couple of exercises just to cement your understanding, and that'll be all for today. A fairly easy lesson and hopefully one that'll be quite straightforward to understand. So today we're looking at ways of describing medieval society, and we're going to start thinking more about what it means to be in the Middle Ages, more about the different dimensions of day-to-day life and how that day-to-day life was different to what came before it or what came after it. Remember that as we go through this PowerPoint, you can pause this video. I'd like you to take notes in your exercise book to make sure that you're just remembering the key features of some of these descriptions of medieval society. What we're going to be using is a system called GRAPES. GRAPES is an acronym and it stands for Geography, Religion, Achievements, Politics, Economics and Social Structures. The idea is that if you can describe all of those things in a society, it could be medieval society or it could be our own society, because one day future historians will be discussing and dissecting our culture and our religion and our achievements. If you can use those things, then you can get a good look, a good snapshot at what it means to live in that society. The first one is geography. Now, geography describes the physical challenges that a society might have faced, and that can include climate. For part of the medieval period, there was what's called a mini ice age, where average temperatures were much lower for a significant period of time. It can also have to do with terrain. If we have a look at the map of Europe to the right there, you can see there's a lot of mountainous regions that sort of run across the heads of peninsulas. If you look at Italy or Spain or Greece, there's also islands, Britain and Ireland, other peninsulas, Scandinavia, and various types of impassable terrain in the form of swamps and rivers, and even if we go down to Spain, deserts. So medieval Europe has a bit of a tendency to break up into smaller parts because it's so difficult for someone from, let's say, the north of England to make the journey all the way to across the English Channel, through the Low Countries, across the Alps to Rome, if they wanted to do that. You can also discuss agriculture, which means farming practices, and infrastructure, which means, essentially in a medieval context, how good were the roads. And I'll give you a clue. The Romans built really good roads at the height of the Roman Empire, and they fell into disrepair throughout the medieval period. Nextly, we have religion. So how a society practices their religion can tell you a lot about the people in that society. And if we look at the picture on the right there, you can see, I don't think this is at all a medieval picture, but it's a nice little illustration. It's an illustration of some crusaders, some Christian crusaders in the Holy Land, so in what's now Israel, surrendering and to a certain extent paying homage to the Muslim ruler Saladin, who was in charge in those parts. So we know from previous lessons that Catholicism was the dominant religion in medieval Western Europe. We know that the Pope had a lot of political power as well as religious power. And we know that kings and other rulers pledged themselves to God and to the Pope. Insofar as they were pledging their allegiance to anyone, it was to the idea of Christianity as a united front. And occasionally the Christians would get a bit big for their boots and they'd go stomping off to the Holy Land, as we see here. And occasionally they'd have success and occasionally they wouldn't. But religious warfare was a big feature of the medieval period. The A in grapes is art, architecture, and achievements. And achievements can be physical or they can be a little bit abstract. One example of an achievement that comes from the medieval period is Parliament. The first Parliament sat in the 13th century, if I'm not mistaken, in England, and other similar bodies sat in other countries around Europe at different times. So achievements don't have to be physical things, they can be ideas. But in the realm of physical achievements, you have things like painting or the building of what's called defensive architecture, which basically just means castles. This is an example of a Motte and Bailey castle that comes from the early medieval period, so just a couple of hundred years after the fall of the Roman Empire. And you can see that the medieval society, especially in that early period, would have organized itself around the idea of being defensible against outside intruders. So you've got one line of defense around the village, and then a second higher line of defense around the keep at the top. And on a site like that, eventually, over the course of a couple of hundred years, as the ruler became more settled and more wealthy, you would generally see that wooden castle turn into a stone one. And more often than not, they're still there today. So when we look at achievements, we're looking at things that have survived the ages. And even though the medieval culture has sort of lapsed, we still have its artifacts. The P in grapes is politics and government. And remember, if I'm going too fast here, you can pause this video and just take note of what you need to. Here's a very good little medieval doodle of a vassal paying homage to his lord. And the clasping of hands there, you see how they're joining their hands together. When we pray in Christian society, when we put our hands together, that's a representation not just of the joining of hands between a human being and God, it's also a representation of other hierarchical agreements, such as the agreement between a lord and their vassal. It used to be, early on in the Christian period, before the Roman Empire disintegrated, it used to be that Christians prayed with their hands out, palms facing upward, like Muslims pray today. But during the medieval period, that turned into a clasping of hands together to represent the link between man and God and the link between vassal and lord. So that's a little digression. In this case, in politics and government, we know that medieval society was very hierarchical. We've looked at the structures. Remember that hierarchical means that it's a very top-down structure. People aren't equals with each other. When you walk down the street, which was likely to be a very muddy, boggy street, and you see a person dressed in a particular way, you would know whether that person was your social equal, whether they were your social better, or whether they were inferior to you. And again, I know I've said this before, but the big tip is odds are they were probably better than you, because 95% of people in this society were peasants who just worked the land. We remember that the king had ultimate power, although that was dependent on how many men and how many bushels of wheat and how much gold his vassals had. And sometimes kings had very powerful vassals who could rise up and challenge his authority. We also know that politics and government depended on personal relationships. So there's no constitution per se that governs a king, although we do see things start to develop like the Magna Carta, which are written documents to govern the behaviour of kings later on in the Middle Ages. But overwhelmingly, how a kingdom was governed, how well it was governed, was dependent on the character of the person governing it and his relationship with the people directly underneath him. Almost there. Economics. Economics just basically means how did people eat? Where did they get their money? What sort of consumer goods did they have? And the answers to those questions in medieval Europe are they didn't eat very well, they didn't have any money, and they didn't have any consumer goods to speak of in the sense that we would understand it either. The big thing to remember about medieval Europe is that right up until the last couple of centuries of that period, there was relatively little trade between different places. Everything that you needed, everything that your family needed was produced in your local village or farming area. All right, so that self-reliance tells us a little bit about how fragmented medieval Europe was. More about that in future lessons. Society and social structures. This just means what sort of people would you meet day to day and what sort of job would they have in society? How does society organize itself? Important positions in medieval Europe included monks and knights, and those are two things that exist today, yes, but are nowhere near as important. Monks were important because they prayed to God for the salvation of the people in the kingdom or the local area, and often noblemen would pay to have the monks pray for their souls or for the souls of relatives or friends who had recently died. And knights, of course, were the members, usually with a little bit of land of their own, of the upper class, who had sworn an oath to defend their liege and the realm. So there's a lot of praying and there's a lot of fighting that goes on in this society, especially compared to ours. All right, now it's your turn. There's a research exercise that I'd like you to complete. It's pretty straightforward. It might take you half an hour of solid Googling. After that, your day is your own. On Sector, not in our daily forum where you're checking in, but in a separate forum that's just going to be open for the next 24 hours. It's entitled the Grapes Forum. Pretty simple, pretty easy to find. I'll post these questions there as well. I'd like you to answer using your own research skills these 4 questions, and it should be about 2 sentences per question for your answer. All right, a little bit of writing, but not too much. The 4 questions are, I want you to find out for me how Jewish people were treated in medieval Europe and why were they treated that way. Okay, there's an interesting insight to medieval religion there. Secondly, I'd like you to find out what day-to-day duties did a monk have? And there's 2 or 3 different things that they did that were important. Thirdly, I'd like you to find and post a link to one piece of medieval art. And here's the hot tip. A lot of medieval art was either religious or violent in nature. That's why knights and monks are so important. It's either God or fighting or tilling the fields. I want you to post that link and just give me a little description of it. And finally, I want you to tell me a little bit about peasants. I want you to give me your opinion. So peasant farmers tended to stay on their land and never leave it. What do you think the reasons for them staying probably not further than a few miles from the place where they were born could have been? Why would a peasant not leave his farm or his village or at the very least his county? I'd like you to give 2 reasons. They don't have to be right or wrong reasons. They just have to be your best educated guess. You might have trouble finding the answer to that last one if you're Googling it. That's going to require you to be a bit creative in your thinking. But have a go. As always, I'll be on the forum between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. So send me a message if you're at all confused about anything, and good luck.